There you go. Yep. All righty. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. How's it going? Great. All right. So just a couple housekeeping items here. Again, red lines of the new contract. If everybody doesn't have those already, they're right up here. Before I jump into it, just a couple of things, some housekeeping. We'll talk about, general things, what's changed. If you guys came to the last presentation, self-admittedly, I'm not a fan of the FARBAR contracts. I'm a NEFAR guy, true and true. Why is that? I find the FARBAR contract to be way overly complicated from a legal standpoint. I've always said if the goal is for the sellers and buyers, which one? That one? If the goal is for the sellers and buyers to actually read the contract, and maybe I'm naive that they do that, I think they have a better chance of understanding the NEFAR contract than this one. When we get into the financing provision of this contract, a lawyer could read that 20 times and not understand what it exactly means, which is why I don't like this contract at all. But just we'll get through it. We'll try to figure it out the best we can and go from there. Again, if we lived in a state where everybody was represented by a lawyer like New York, that'd be one thing. But in reality, most people are not represented independently by an attorney. So I don't think they really understand what they're signing. That being said, disclaimer out the way. This comes into effect on November 1st. That's when the contract comes into effect. All these changes have already been approved and passed, so they're not going to change in all likelihood. In a general sense, what has changed? The as-is contract has changed. The residential contract, non-as-is, has changed. 7 of the riders were updated, and 3 riders are brand new. So massive changes. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start and just use the residential non-as-is as a guide, mainly because it's going to be very difficult if we go back and forth from as-is to non-as-is, and there's so many overlaps in those two, which I will point out that it's going to be most efficient, I think, just to do it in that format. One thing to remember when you're reading this red line, which can be very confusing if you don't see the legend, any text that is not black reflects a change. Don't pay attention to the color, okay? I'm going to point out things that they have deemed to be massively significant, especially the financing provision. So again, in their notes, and again, all of this information that I'm saying is available on the Florida Realtors website, but they concentrate on 2 major things that they deem to be massively different. One being the financing contingent provision, which we'll spend most of our time on, and another one about what's acceptable as a form of communication, okay? But we're just gonna start at the beginning because that's just how my mind operates, and then we'll go through it just like last time, interactive question and answer. No formality to it, we'll just get going. All right, so we'll start on page 1. Obviously, we'll see here in the personal property section, this is a change to both contracts. Essentially, what they've done is they've included in personal property smart home devices and television mounts. Do one of these real quick. How are you? Excuse me. There you go. Thank you. And again, that's just common sense, right? Because everybody has, most people these days have television mounts, so that was a logical change. And, the rings, the smart home devices, stuff like that, pretty common sense. So change right there. Nothing too much major on page 1. That I really saw here. They made the email address line longer. Apparently that was requested by numerous people. I guess people have long email addresses. So we will go to page 2. We'll go right into number 4.
If there's any differences between the NEFAR and this contract, can you point those out when you get to those sections?
I can. It's not really how I prepared it today because again, I'm really concentrating on the changes to this contract. I can do that, but I'd probably want to do that in a separate context or a separate thing. But I'll try.
Can I pick up a little bit in the beginning?
Yeah, go ahead.
Is there a FAR contract versus a FARBAR contract?
I mean, to me, this is just the one Florida Bar, Florida Association of Realtors changes contract. Yep.
Yeah, because they had to submit an offer on it as is contract. So I went looking at the various contracts, and it seemed like there were 3 different contracts I could choose from.
Right.
You were relating to that.
Yeah.
One was called the FAR contract without the bar.
Yeah.
And FARBAR, the FARBAR as is.
FARBAR is as is, this is.
Yeah. So there's, what we're looking at is the non-as-is contract.
Residential.
Yeah, for residential.
So this is the main.
This is the main one. Now, there were changes to the as-is.
Because that's what we mostly see in the MLS, is to say, just use the as is.
Sure.
part.
Sure. Yeah, and most of these are consistent, so it's consistent on both of them, so it doesn't really matter. There aren't really that many changes that are, just to the.
Let's split some hairs here.
Yeah.
So it's been explained to me that the NEFAR contract by default is as is, like there's no
Yes.
repairs
Yeah.
provided. So I always see these people, you gotta submit on the as is contract,
Right.
FARBAR, I'm like, why can't you just use the NEFAR?
Well,
We're
it's
not,
usually.
because the normal FAR contract does make provisions for up to, 3%?
Mhm.
Like written in the.
Yeah.
Or you can change
It
it to a
actually makes
dollar amount.
provisions that the seller will agree to repair up to a certain amount, whereas
Upfront.
the EFAR has no such language. It doesn't.
Again, but that's why, again, I like the simplicity of the NEFAR contract is you can write whatever you want into section 17. So we can define that as is in section 17. And really, as is to me has always been a bit of a distractor unless we're talking about, doesn't mean you still can't negotiate repairs. It doesn't mean, unless we're talking about on the front end, removing contingencies in full, then, we could still get there at one point anyway, so again, I agree 100%. Me too. I'm with you. All right.
And I'll just throw in on, you're gonna see more of the FARBAR contract because the state, with Zillow, DJ and Lindsay, all these ones that are members of multiple associations, they're only gonna, learn the FARBAR. And if they're in control of the listing, they're gonna say, has to be FARBAR. So you're gonna see it, and Zillow has their own, so you're gonna see a lot more leaning toward that. Yep.
Flat fee people are based out of Tampa, and they're like.
Because they're not gonna go out and learn each association's contract. So
Exactly.
They're gonna say FARBAR is what we know, that's what it has to be on.
When you're competing, you do what do they say when in Rome?
Yeah.
So when we take listings, NEFAR only, we get the.
Yeah.
No, NEFAR only.
No, that's exactly true.
It's definitely a necessary evil. He's absolutely right. Because you get outside this region, it's the primary contract, right? So you
I've
have to.
actually seen people who state that.
You have to understand.
I do it.
I do it. I
Yeah.
do it.
You're fine. Yeah. All right, so we will jump into number 4 again. So they changed the heading of number 4 to closing dates. This is merely to help people locate this information in one paragraph. So again, just a little cosmetic change there. Now in number 4, they make an emphasis here about the closing agent and collected funds, okay? And again, that's on line 58 is when we're talking about collected funds. And to understand that change, again, like this thing, there's a legend to this thing. You have to go to standard S to look at that, again, which is on page 13. Standard S is line 671. And it talks about checks tendered, received, including deposits, having becoming actually and finally collected and deposited in the account of the escrow agent or closing agent. Closing and disbursement of funds and delivery of closing documents may be delayed by closing agent until such amounts have been collected. My question to this is, which I'm not sure, are we talking about physically collected? Are we talking about me getting a binder check or a cashier's check at closing and physically depositing that? Or are we talking about the bank definition of collected funds? The bank definition of collected funds is much different than collecting a physical check. I've seen that firsthand. I've been given fake cashier's checks multiple times. So, and sometimes that can take 3 days to come back as, fraudulent. Again, that's when it's collected, goes to the Fed, they go to the bank, and then they let you know if it's good or not. So that's a question that I have. I mean, it seems like the way, just my interpretation is they're not getting that deep into it, but that's generally the context of I've always used collected funds in my career and even just in understanding how banks operate. So pretty interesting question there. If that means that I can be held accountable for not following this contract until I follow a bank definition of collected funds, well, that means that everything's going to have to be wired. Binders have to be wired, all cash to close have to be wired, and that standard changes title company to title company. Some title companies only accept wires. We try to make it a little easier. Obviously, you don't have to wire binders. We get those checks all the time. Same thing with cash to close. If it's a small amount, which is a sliding scale, I don't have a set line of demarcation, but if it's $5,000, $10,000, I'll usually accept that. Most people will not. Again, most people won't show up at a closing with an ID and hand you a fake check. I mean, but you never quite know. So just some interesting stuff there.
Would there be any change to, like, if the binder was being held at somebody's office as opposed to the closing?
I don't think so. I don't think so at all. I don't think that changes. Again, I think that practice will still remain. Yep.
So, I mean, it looks like it's stating that it has to be in your account.
That's the way I'm interpreting it.
In
Yeah.
your account.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
You could be in possession of a check, but
Right.
it's not, the funds are not in your account.
Sure.
It's not officially collected.
I mean, yeah, exactly. And it does give us, unfortunately, you guys have seen that as well. We all go to closings sometimes where the wires are not there. Sometimes there's confusion about when the wires go out. They go with batches. Not everybody sends wires every day. So again, there's language in there that, we can delay funding clearly, which we have to do until, that wire comes in. It usually does come in. So again, it's probably not going to be something that drastic. All right, no questions there. Again, and that's both contracts. Both contracts have that change. We'll go into the next one will be number 5. Again, the extension of closing date. This is, again, we're really looking at line 67. This is the old CFPB excuse, right? The 10 days. That has been shortened to 7 days. 7 days. Now, an explanation of that, their explanation was basically buyers would believe an extension was merited when it wasn't, which I've encountered many times as well. They also added language, if you look at this, which limits the extension of a closing date to a maximum of 7 days if all of the following apply to the contract and loan status. All of the following. Paragraph 8B is checked, obviously, with financing. Loan approval was obtained and underwriting is complete. So you have to hit all 3 of those thresholds to use that as justification to delay closing. I think any shortening of this period is a good thing because I've rarely seen it used in an accurate context. It's usually just a leverage clause to me. So I think the shorter the better, just on my opinion on that.
Do you think they'll change the FARBAR contract on that? Or?
It's a good question. I'm not on that board, but that is a very good question. Yep. They a lot of times I'm sure NFAR is looking at, they're all looking at this to see, to kind of mirror it. So I wouldn't be surprised if they did.
So this is really only if they were gonna close, but like a hurricane or natural disaster came through and had to delay it?
This is more CFPB stuff. That's a different session when you're talking about natural disasters. And again, there is references to that we'll talk about later relating to COVID and pandemics and stuff like that. But this is just delivery requirements. This is Carlos's game right there. The delivery of the documents, the 3-day, the loan estimates, the 3-day disclosure period, stuff like that. So it's but again, you have to hit those 3 thresholds to use that. Does that make sense? Not much really, not a whole lot really changed in that, but still interesting to look at that.
Anybody in here gone beyond my kind of contract, go beyond, I've never, like 10 days. or
Most
something.
people are getting it.
Yeah, I mean,
It was a little rough at first, but most people.
you have
You don't-
13 because of CFPB?
Actually, no.
I
But they use that as a justification?
It was an appraisal issue.
Okay.
Never mind.
Okay, no worries, no worries, no worries at all.
Just backing up to the closing date.
Yeah.
if you don't mind.
Yeah.
When I read the NEFAR contract, the wording is on or before.
Okay.
And one of the things I always try is to make it as much before as possible. This doesn't seem to have that variability.
It does not,
I mean, if it's that date, it's that date.
correct.
Okay.
Yep. Shall occur on, correct, yep.
So if you wanted to close.
But I don't think I don't think it will be breached, to
I mean,
close
you probably
before.
negotiate an earlier date
Yeah.
Be in writing, wouldn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah, they make you
or
do an
change the
addendum.
contract.
what's that?
They make you do an addendum.
Yeah,
to
change the
for sure, for sure. But that can easily be done at closing too.
Closing early.
Right,
Late, yeah.
absolutely.
Sometimes, I mean, if somebody has to
I
move.
had one deal where that was an issue, and the buyers literally scheduled closing with our knowledge, like a week early.
I've had a
The seller,
weird
like,
issue once.
wasn't ready to.
And
They're
it was,
like, well, it says order before, and I'm like, yeah, I get it, but like, phone call with the night.
well, and as it turned out, the agent was the one that needed money, so it's like. Could let us know. No, we can do that. It's Navy Federal. How about that?
All right, let's jump into everybody's favorite topic, occupancy and possession. Okay, so we're gonna look at this section. We're also gonna talk about rider T, again, as it pertains to this section. That is just the pre and post occupancy rider. So let's talk about it. Again, this changes in both contracts. We're looking at line 81 here. One thing they added, again, before we get into discussion of occupancy, one thing they added is you have to disclose seasonal and short-term rentals if the property is subject to a lease or occupancy after closing. So again, that's pulling in Airbnb, VRBO, stuff like that, that has to be disclosed. So that is an addition. You'll see that in line 81. So I think that's probably a good idea.
Like bookings that are already.
That are already in place past the closing date, correct. That has to be disclosed. Yep, and that's, yep. And that's right there in 81. You can see that with the green and then the purple language as well, short-term vacation. Now, again, if you look to in line 78, which they talk about the rider T, the pre-closing occupancy. So again, we have to look at rider T to have a discussion about that. And basically, if you guys are familiar with the rider T, the pre and post, there are some changes to it. And really what they changed was in the prior language, it only stated a lease. It only defined the relationship between the parties as a lease. And again, I'll get into why that's important here in 1 second. The new rider, if there's a pre or post occupancy agreement, talks about a pre-closing agreement as a contrast to a lease.
It doesn't make a tenant landlord.
Yeah, I'll explain that.
Oh, that's awesome.
So, and their justification for that was because they stated that sometimes a pre-occupancy is just 1 or 2 days and parties prefer fewer details and wish to avoid the formalities of a lease. Okay. I mentioned this in the last presentation I had. This is, I know it because I've debated it with a lot of the people in my business. How are we defining the relationship is extremely important when you talk about something going wrong and removing them. Okay, I know this personally because I've litigated landlord-tenant evictions. I've done the other flavors of those, which are occupancy cases, unlawful detainer, and ejectment. So how you define the person in the home is extremely important with how you have to get them out in that disaster situation. I prefer landlord-tenant. I prefer them being defined as a tenant because in the Landlord-Tenant Act, on a possession count, a possession lawsuit, you get what's called summary administration. And that is a shortened answer period for someone to answer. That's 5 days under summary administration because there's a public policy to put homes back into the possession of landlords when a tenant is defaulted. So they shorten the answer period from 20 days. If this is a pre-closing agreement, which this new language brings into, and it is not a lease, and I took that client, and somebody filed an eviction to get my client out because he was unreasonable and stayed past the deadline, I would file a motion to dismiss that there's no landlord-tenant relationship, that he's an occupant, and that requires a 20-day period to answer. And those cases are easier to stall if you have a disingenuous attorney. So again, my position is that, and that's why in my occupancy agreements, I always say that the parties agree that the relationship is governed by Chapter 83 of the Florida Landlord-Tenant Act. Just my opinion. And again, it's just because there's not a lot of people in my business that do what I do that have actually litigated those cases, to be honest with you. Most people are just transactional. They don't see that practically occur, but I have for sure. So just my thoughts on that. Any questions on that?
Did you say that you would argue that they were an occupant?
I would say that, so if it was, this new rider adds a second form of a relationship. The old rider just said lease. This now adds what they call a pre-closing agreement. Again, designed for the simplicity of the 1 to 2 day occupancy periods. I said, I would argue if that was the case, I would argue that it's not a landlord-tenant relationship and it's more difficult therein to remove someone, which if I was a seller, I would want it less difficult to remove someone if somebody had taken occupancy and the deal didn't close.
So we're talking about the seller needs a couple days to get out? Is that what we're talking
Well,
about?
normally we're doing it post-closing, so you're talking about pre-closing.
The language is added to both the pre-closing occupancy rider and the post-closing occupancy rider. So that they've added a different, basically there's now 2 ways you can define it: lease, landlord tenant, and then pre-closing or post-closing agreement. Well, if it's not landlord tenant, there has to be some other legal relationship. And to me, that means you're an occupant.
Buyer.
You don't have the same remedies.
Correct. Different statutes, different process, completely much more difficult. You're going to get an evidentiary hearing 100% if you're an occupant. I mean, that can be thousands of dollars to prep for. That can be 2 months down the line if you stall and say, I'm not available on this hearing date, so.
You can stay in for 20 years and get
So would you check the box then?
I would just make sure, I would really just, to me, I would, if I was, you have to use the rider, I would cross out pre-closing agreement to me. And again, I know we're not looking at the rider, but they've added that language in there that says pre-closing agreement. So to me, because I personally want the relationship to be landlord tenant, I would line item veto pre-closing agreement.
So you would just cross out like 78?
Well, no, I'd be saying when I got to the rider, again, this is the language of the rider. Again, it's just, that was really the only change to it. I would just cross out pre-closing agreement and just say, and I would just define it as a lease personally, but.
Is that only pertaining to short term, like the 5 days, or is that,
Yeah.
because, we get all those, like on one of my listings, I got, your seller can move out at any time,
This is about the buyer.
after close.
It's about both.
Closing on this day, they can.
undefined.
Yeah.
And
They're
for
talking about
30
buyer.
days, there's another one in my neighborhood that says that, if you put a contract in on this house, the seller gets to stay for 60 days with no rent.
Right. Yeah, again, I mean, you're right. That's becoming more and more frequent, right? And again, this is both pre and post. So it's both sides of that. Again, just saying, that's why I like the NEFAR contract. You can write that into section 17. You can have an exhibit A that is the agreement that defines the germane terms of the agreement and bullet points signed by both sides.
What's interesting is
So.
that there's actually a rider, which I didn't know.
Yeah, exactly.
Not in NEPA, but in.
And this, yeah.
You can't
shouldn't mix, you shouldn't mix the contracts, right? Like.
No. Not at all. Yeah, no, don't do that. No. Keep those definitely separate. Yeah, I mean, I've seen that as well, but yeah, that's because just in how they're defining terms are different, large, capital letters.
That's
Yes.
what we don't really see.
So where is it that you're saying we should cross out? That's
So,
what I wanna-
so again, this is the contract. Again, I don't have the riders in front of me right now.
But not cross out anything on here.
I would not. No, I mean, I would just define it in the rider or, again, make it clear and again, it's hard to write in stuff too much in this contract. I would just say that the parties agree that they're defined as landlord and tenant under Florida law, something as simple as that. And again, it's just because of the worst case scenario. It's just because of, removing someone, but not to get too lost in that,
We've
but
got a lot of experience with, I haven't really done too many of those, but anybody have like a prominent one?
Usually I have had an attorney with a title company
Yeah.
draft up, it goes out.
Yeah.
It then has to go to the lender for approval. I've never done a rider.
Yeah.
I've never sent it to the lender. for
But I've always
approval.
used the need fund too.
Has anybody done a pre-closing occupancy?
Oh, yeah. all the time.
You
No,
do that? I've never
pre-closing.
done
Yeah.
it.
Prior,
Yeah.
after closing, I have a couple of times.
I think,
Oh, yeah, well,
You can see where it
pre-closing, yeah, a
happened.
couple of times, just because we had some.
I've had worse experiences with post-closing agreements, to be quite frankly with you. Especially when there's a large security deposit, one of the most awful litigation cases I was ever associated with was in Nassau County, multi-million-dollar house. And there was a $50,000 or $75,000 holdback. If you get a disingenuous person, and there are lots of them, that think that that's an extra kitty of money to go after when they take occupancy, and especially the more amounts you put in there and the longer the period, the greater percentage chances that you're gonna have an issue. And he refused to sign that release. He thought that was an ability to renegotiate repairs, that he made up new scuffs and stuff on the wood floors. And I mean, it costs an ungodly amount of money to get that to mediation. So I cringe when I see large amounts held in escrow on post-closing agreements. I think if you represent sellers and listings and stuff like that, and there is a post-closing agreement, it's going to be lengthy. You are doing a great service to your client if you limit the amount of money that's held in escrow. If it takes something nominal on a big deal or what have you to get them to play ball, that's fine. But when you're talking about putting serious money, you have to understand that it doesn't matter who's factually right or wrong. It doesn't matter who's legally right or wrong at the front end. It matters, will both sides execute a release that I can release that money? If not, my hands are tied. I can't do anything. So, I can leverage that. He'll nuisance value. He'll give me half of that, or whatever, so it can just be a very disingenuous game. Any questions? Okay, no more questions on that? Perfect. Make sure I didn't miss any.
And to just build on that, because that's what I run into all the time, that's the same thing with binders. If you get into for
Great
sale
point.
by owner or something like that, where everyone's not on the same page, you still have to have both signatures. So it's the same thing. That money's sitting there. They can't release it until both parties sign. So it's the same exact thing.
That is a great point. I mean, he couldn't be any more correct. There is no difference between those two scenarios at all. Big amount in escrow, big binder, same scenario. Great point, for sure.
I send a timeline to everybody involved to make sure everybody is well aware of the timeline.
I really I like that on the front end when we receive those. That's very, I think, helpful for clarity. I mean, again, like the contract, we're assuming people read the email, right? They don't just move it, but it is very helpful, I believe. Yeah, for sure. All right, so let me flip back here. So now we are getting into, all right, now we're getting to the financing section. This is what they define as the most major change in the contract. Multiple levels, major change. We'll go through it bit by bit. It's going to be confusing. I'm telling you, it's going to be extremely confusing. This is basically a complete overhaul in many ways of this provision. And again, if you can read this the first time and understand it, then you're incredibly intelligent. Yeah, I have some colleagues who would be baffled by this. But anyway, let's just start, okay? Again, and this applies, to be clear, both contracts. We're talking about both contracts, as is, not as is, all right? So again, line 96, cash transaction. They just simplified this language. This was not that hard. They deleted that lender requirements would have no impact on the contract. They just found that any reference to lender requirements was unnecessary. So that was a simplification. I don't mind that. I like that. So big fan of that. All right, now we get into 8B, and this is where we get deep into it. And let me pull my other sheet out here. So basically in 8B, from a broad standpoint, we are now adding 2 tasks to what they're defining as loan approval period. Just like before, you have to obtain your normal financing approval, but new to the contract is that you have to get a satisfactory appraisal before the loan period, approval period expires. That's a major, major change. Have to get the appraisal. So think about that. When I'm sure. What's that?
You had to have the appraisal on it for loan.
Not under the old contract. You did not. That is correct. That is correct. No, you're fine.
Yeah.
And again, when you get into that question, why was the change made? It was really to expedite the receipt of the appraisal if it was required by the buyer's lender. So again, under the current contract, the old contract, a low appraisal could literally derail a transaction as late as closing. This one requires it to be in, if required by the lender, before the loan approval period expires. That's a major change, huge change. So although a low appraisal can still derail a transaction, if it's received before expiration of the loan approval period, the property can be returned to the market quicker. So again, it's an efficiency thing, right? And one thing on that point, because this is such a significant change, you have to, and no version of the contract had this, remember this when you fill in the blank that establishes the duration of the loan approval period. Because appraisals can take some time. You don't want to be in a position where you ask for an extension of that. So I think you're really going to have some deep conversation, with the loan officer or the buyer, who usually has buyer's agent has a relationship with loan officer, about, because as this comes out, not everybody's going to be right on it immediately in November, right? So I think you're going to run into some issues until people, lenders will not catch up to that change. Okay.
Why did you say you don't want to have to ask for an extension because of it? I mean, if I shorten it to like 15 days, then that would be irritating, right? Like for the person, like, well, why did you cut it so short if appraisals are running long? But if the default, the standard is 30 and I put 30,
right, then
the appraisal should have been in. It's not something we could have controlled.
It's like if you have baby federal. You ask them. And they say, and you say, can you give me loan approval with the appraisal before 30 days? And they say, nope, give us 45.
Right.
You have that relation, or you have that conversation before you write your contract. Really what you're saying, right?
I was just gonna say, I'll touch one thing from a lender standpoint on the loan approvals that we always see, because like when we see a contract comes over, 45-day contract, we're like, great, we got some time on this, and then a 20-day loan approval, we're like, that doesn't help us. You might as well do a 25-day closing date at that point, right? So it's the same, just so you know. But the things that can hold us up is, and we had this the other day, and is homeowners insurance. A bounded policy can hold us up from getting our clear to close. Now, some agents are like, is everything else signed off on? Yeah, everything's signed off on, but the homeowner's insurance. So we know that there's not gonna be an issue once they get signed off on, but sometimes there may be a repair that's being done or something like
If
that.
there's a
So,
storm.
or a storm, of course, yeah. So that, loan approval, if it's a clear to close, something as small as a bounded insurance policy could hold that up, which does happen sometimes.
Do you agree with what they're saying that, I mean, people could use the appraisal as late as closing as, under the old contract? I mean, that's essentially what they're saying as a justification.
Right, which is crazy. I thought the NEFAR, I think it went with.
Yeah,
NEFAR
NEFAR,
goes
yeah.
with the financing contingency, right?
Yeah. That's a land of logic.
That's land of logic.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, it is nuts because, when appraisal is delayed, I've always known you need to make sure you're extending your financing contingency if the appraisal's not back yet.
Right.
That's obviously a big issue, but
Sure.
yeah, that's good. I guess a good change.
Yeah,
Surveys are coming in late these days too, right?
Surveys, yeah. So lenders, we don't tend to care about that,
Mhm.
but title. obviously,
Surveys are very backed up right
we're
now,
gonna-
that's for sure.
Not gonna be able to close.
So that's
without
not for financing approval.
No,
No, just for the closing, you
Just
can't
for
close,
closing,
closing,
yeah.
yeah, we
Yeah.
can't close.
Right.
they
They're
do
not gonna
change
issue the
this.
Florida Form 9 without it, and we're not gonna close without a Florida Form 9, so.
So they are kind of tied.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Yeah, everyone's always like, do you require it? I'm like, we don't require the survey, but we require the Florida Form 9, they require the survey for the Florida Form 9, so it's kind of
Okay.
all of us together really.
Would that
Oh,
be
okay.
built into delivering marketable title?
What's that?
Would that be?
And if
I mean, yeah, survey,
there's,
without
survey-
encroachments, that's always built
Sure.
in that for sure. Yep,
You have to have just a copy of it. You don't have to have
Correct.
the original.
correct, that's correct.
The reason between the loan approval period and the closing date is to give the occupant time to move out for sure.
Sure.
Yeah.
No, I get that,
Yeah.
yeah.
Right.
Post-closing.
And doing.
So no, I totally get it, no, I get it, I just say, yeah, if you're gonna do a 20-day loan approval or 25-day, you might as well just do a 30-day closing, assuming that the seller and everybody else can close.
Absolutely.
We don't need 2.5 weeks to get the docs to the title. We can do that in 24 hours.
Sure. But yeah, definitely, but yes.
I was just curious how many of us consider the loan approval as a clear. to
Great
close.
question, by the way. I'd like an answer to that.
Yeah.
That's
I
what I
would
would think.
say-
Because once you have a loan approval, then it gets sent to
Then
credit
it's
close.
gonna.
Yeah, so what's crazy is I have some agents that think loan approval is conditional loan approval, which I typically have within a day of the loan being submitted to underwriting. So I've had agents go, we have loan approval? I was like, yeah, it's conditional loan approval, but we have loan approval. And they're like, oh, great, then we're good.
No.
If that's the way you see it, sure. But then I have, of course, we need that clear to close. Now, the way we do things is we'll sign off on everything and then up as fast as possible up front. And then the only conditions we're hopefully waiting on are title, appraisal, and homeowner's insurance. So we can't get the clear to close without those documents. And again, the homeowner's insurance, something as small as that could actually hold us up from getting the actual clear to close. I think it's more of a conversation with everybody. Do you feel comfortable that
For sure.
that's not going to hold?
To
up the
answer your
close?
question, Gwen, I mean, I see clear to close as loan approval.
I think most do.
Is that-
Right.
I would agree.
Clear to close
Yeah.
definitely would be, but is there a time where we don't use clear to close?
CFPB
as loan
requirements.
approval.
Delivery requirements, right?
Right.
Yes.
CFPB, some of that.
CFPB, I mean,
And
we have to
then-
have the closing disclosure out within 3 days of closing, which we typically do well in advance for the most part. We don't have to wait for a clear to close to get it out. And most lenders don't, I mean.
So that is a good question, like what should we be defining loan approval
Mhm.
as in the contract? Does it have language stating?
I mean, again,
ready to go?
the loan approval period, again, is just two prong under this contract.
Yeah.
Again,
Yeah.
Yep.
it's just really two prong. But again, you can't understate in 107. I mean, if you read the stuff, they present this as the biggest change, the biggest single change to the contract is adding the appraisal as a component, a subcomponent of loan approval. So that's right there in 107. Yep.
I think it's just clarifying it because I would think that everybody knows that loan approval has to be the whole package.
It's not clarifying it. Again, you could, not at all. You could, under the prior contracts, again, it was not a part of loan approval. It was not. So you could get all the way up to closing and use that as a way to blow it. You could.
And then I also get where they have loan approval in 30 days and then they check off that they're gonna close in 30 days.
Yeah, we see
And
that a lot.
I'm always happy.
We see that a lot, but at the same time, to us, we're just still shooting on that 30-day
Right.
closing. So it doesn't matter.
Right.
We're gonna get it clear close as soon as possible, but yeah.
So yeah, it gets to, but that's pretty major.
It should be like closing or close approval 27, closing 34, close approval 30.
Well, I always
3
read
days.
10 days, so I always send it back and saying, okay, you want 30 days and we're gonna be closing in 40.
Right, that's what I say, yeah.
And again, they are trying to expedite the lender's receipt of the appraisal. I don't, obviously, I think we would all like that. I don't know if adding contractual language is going to practically produce that based on what's going on in the market. But I mean, but hey, it's, you got to swing the bat, I guess.
Sure, absolutely.
So again, that is a significant change. And going back to your question again, I think Terry discussed that as well. It's, I don't know. I just see I don't think that minor amendments or extensions are a major deal. If two parties really in good faith want to do a transaction, I guess I'm just a bit jaded that I see I see the situations where people are generally disingenuous a lot more from a legal standpoint. So I try to be over protective. I'll always overshoot in a way than try to have to go to someone for something they don't legally have to do, So I just kind of look at it that way, but I understand. Good question. All right. So that is out the way. We're going to flip again. That's 107. We'll flip to the next page. And if you need any exhibit as to how many changes there are, just look at page 3. I mean, everything in color is new. That's a lot of information. So let's start bit by bit. Okay. We will start here. Let me get on my notes. 110. Okay. So if we look at, let's look at line 115. Okay. We see here loan approval, which requires buyer to sell other real property, shall not be deemed or considered loan approval unless rider V is attached. Okay. So again, you have to use rider V if it's truly contingent on the sale and it be part of loan approval. Have to use rider V, 100%.
And that's whether it's cash or.
Correct. Correct.
What's a contingent on a sale these days? Do we even have that?
And again, if you go, and again, and if you go to their notes on rider V, they state rider V again, which is the contingency rider. They add language in there, and it states that basically the new language clarifies this contingency will have no force and effect if, number one, the buyer's property does not close by the date specified in the blank of the form, and number two, the buyer does not timely deliver written notice terminating the contract. The previous version of this rider did not address what happened if the buyer failed to provide written notice to the seller of either termination or waiving that contingency on the sale. So they flushed that out a little bit by adding some additional language to that rider V. But again, you have to use the rider V.
If you're making the sale contingent.
Correct.
Sale into their home, you use rider.
You have to. And then again, and if you do use rider V, that wraps that into the definition of loan approval. Okay.
And that's part of the business.
So you
Correct.
couldn't have a same day closing them.
You could do
Well,
a
loan
separate.
approval would be hard to help.
It'd be difficult. I mean,
Sell your property at 7 a.m.
yeah.
Oh,
It-
remember simultaneous closings, y'all?
That is, yeah.
It's gonna take some more, but it could be done. Simultaneous, because they have post occupancy.
Right, right.
I'm gonna stay here 3 days and go like, close on my other side. No right. Yep. I wouldn't recommend it, but it could be done.
One thing again that when we go back just really quickly to the definition of an appraisal, they also expanded that definition to include alternative valuations. So that's a new addition. Some lenders no longer require any valuation but some lenders on certain loans accept valuation products other than appraisals. So they wrap that into there as well. So synonymous, really. Just FYI on that. All right, so then let's go to looking at, make sure I get this right. I don't want to make sure I miss everything. Again, this is very. Okay, so rider fee. I'm gonna now looking at line 121. So again, this is a big change. How many times do you run into the situation where you want to know what's going on again with the buyer's loan, what's happening in this time period? Some realtors more than others are very adamant about that. You know, they want to know what delays, et cetera. So if we look at this, they've added buyers shall, upon written request, keep seller and broker formally informed about the status of buyer's mortgage loan application, appraisal, and loan approval, including any property-related conditions of loan approval. So the explanation here, the buyer's duty to keep the seller informed of the status of the loan application, loan approval, appraisal, and property-related conditions during the sale process now depends on the seller's written request for this information from the buyer. You have to serve a written request. And again, that'll be defined later in the provision. We talk about acceptable forms of communication. And one of the other major changes where they've removed, and we'll get to that later, text as a acceptable way to communicate. They've removed that. They've clarified that.
So basically, we have to get our sellers to ask the buyer for updates.
The buyer has to do a written request. The previous version of this contract did not require the seller to make a written request for this. So now you have to make a literal.
I think her question was, is it actual seller or seller's agent?
I mean, I think it's going to be done both ways. I mean, you know, I'm assuming this is going to, it's like a lot of things in law, there's a difference between literal and practical. I mean, I think most people won't push back if it comes from an agent. You know, I'm sure some people will.
Basically have to ask for written permission to the lender to give us information.
To the buyer. To the buyer. Yep. To the yep. Correct.
Well, and then the lender.
Yeah, well, they make it, we'll get to that in section of it. Yeah, they make a big point about that change with that. But again, that is a big change. Nor did the previous version of the contract really didn't require the buyer to specifically inform the seller of property related conditions contained with loan approval at all. So it expands what you have a right to get, but it requires you to do it in a written format. So not bad.
The
Seller wants information from the buyer as to what's going on. Why is everything taking so long? You know, yeah, to the buyer to get, yeah. So, yep, buyer shall upon written request, yep, keep seller, yep.
So as long as we, as the realtor representing them, notify the seller's agent that this is where we're at with the lender, that suffices.
I mean,
If the seller is satisfied with that information.
yeah, I mean, to be safe, certainly I would, again, if you want to be uber conservative, have it signed off by both of you.
That goes against like the entire concept of having an agent.
I know. And again, I still say, how are they going to know? I mean, no buyers or sellers are going to know about this because they're not going to read this ridiculous clause. And so if you don't tell them, how are they going to know? I mean, you know, it's like.
Unless you have an astute seller who's done this a few times and has said, hey, what's going on with the buyer's loans?
Yeah. But will they know that on November 1st, you know, this written request came into play? I mean, unless it, probably not.
So each time they want information, the seller's supposed to write a request.
If it's about anything pertaining to the loan, correct. Yep, that's line 121. Yep.
There's no like blanket once, tell the seller to keep me updated.
No, I mean, because under the prior contract, it did not require the buyer to really do a whole lot, to be honest with you, so this one kind of flushes that out a little bit. So I think while it seems good, I think this one's going to create some issues. I do.
Well, then you have lenders that, I mean, lenders have to adhere to privacy. And
Exactly.
They can't just give you the seller every information about the buy. They just need to know, okay, are we getting close to approval? Or
Exactly.
Is there a big,
So it
is
does
there
say
a hold up,
our
is there
contract, the
issues?
buyer agrees to.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Yep.
Any other place in Florida?
Yep. So I think that can create some issues there for sure.
You can tell where they've had more lawsuits.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to create lawsuits, right? All right. So again, we have that. That's the next one. Then again, staying with the section, again, there's so many changes to this. Look at 127. All of this is new language, okay? Line 127, all new language. If within the loan approval period, buyer obtains loan approval, buyer shall notify seller of the same in writing prior to the expiration of the loan approval period, or if buyer is unable to obtain loan approval, but buyer is satisfied with buyer's ability to obtain loan approval and proceed to closing, buyer shall deliver written notice to seller confirming the same prior to the expiration of the loan approval period.
So they didn't get loan approval.
But they can roll the dice and say, hey, we think we're going to get it, but we have to inform you in writing.
But.
So either or.
Uh-huh. Yeah. So basically,
In the day for the day too, right? Because
pardon?
in the day for the day, it
Right.
just has to be before that end of the day.
So basically, the buyer now has until the end of loan approval to inform the seller in writing that loan was obtained. Previously, the buyer was required to, quote, promptly advise the seller upon receipt of loan approval. Promptly advise means little to nothing.
People there can't be clear to close.
Right. I mean, and again, you have to watch, I mean, whenever there's language like this, again, lawyers love swimming in ambiguity, which means nothing. If it's not, straightforward, must, means nothing, so again, this is kind of a big change as well. And again, this new language specifying that a buyer who does not obtain loan approval may remain in the transaction. Again, if they're satisfied with their ability to obtain it and close, and they deliver written notice to the seller within the loan approval period. So
And the need for, and I know we don't really want to talk about need for, because that's just going to throw a whole lot of confusion, but they used to give us so many days, and then they changed that to, if you don't get loan approval,
Yep.
you either proceed.
Yeah.
Or terminate.
Yeah.
Now, I like to ask for an extension if I don't have loan approval by
Sure.
that date. That binder,
Prior to expiration of the loan, it used to be 5 days, right?
yeah, it used to give us 3 or 5 days.
Says prior to the expiration of the loan.
Yeah.
Yep.
So,
Which makes sense.
which a lot of people won't do an extension of financing.
Sure.
And that binder could be at risk.
sure, 100%, guaranteed. Yep. I mean, just think about what we've done so far, and we're from 96 to 130. We've added another major component to what loan approval is. We've put on a written request requirement, which wasn't there before. We talk about Rider V as a mandatory. I mean, so with the ability to roll the dice and still proceed, right? All this is brand new. All this is brand new. So, think about the confusion as to, did you do everything you were supposed to do in loan approval? What if you didn't give me the request when I asked you for it in writing? Stuff like that.
So what does that mean, Keith? Is that?
I mean, again, you can, I think it's like every other position. If you get into a situation where you're in litigation or you have attorneys on both sides, they're going to look for any argument they can make across the board, to represent their client zealously. So, I would say you breached the contract by that, so how are you going to rectify that breach? I mean, so again, I think there's just so many ways you can misstep in this, and which I don't know why we're trying to set us up to fail, but just my thoughts on that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, you know, I appreciate the fact that we're doing this and coming together, but you know, you got people across the state that don't know
Sure.
anything, have no relationship with a brokerage.
There's going to be probably a 6 month to who knows long period to where people have no idea, especially when you're dealing with people south of here or in general around here, that these things have changed. And so, you know,
I mean, I've come across out of town listing agents, listing property in Jacksonville.
Yeah.
Wanting a FARBAR because that's what they're used to.
sure.
And then they don't even know how to read the contract.
Right. Right.
So.
Exactly.
And it's like, why are you, it's aggravating.
I know.
Like,
I know what
"Oh,
you mean.
why are you using an out of town?"
Exactly.
Just refer them to the attorney at the
There,
time.
yeah, and then they end up doing a consultation, right?
There's a name and number, and if you would like to understand what you're signing, here it is.
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
The conflict here is between, no offense, a lawyer-written document that protects for every way things can go wrong,
Sure.
which we should be cognizant of, and our own personal standards of how we manage a relationship. You know, I'm thinking about when you notify people and stuff like that. Communications in our job is a very important thing. And, you know, put all this aside, my inclination is to make sure everybody that's involved in this thing is on the same page, the same time schedule and everything. Communicate, look for problems, communicate. We need to be cognizant of this, but it doesn't mean we give up our approaches, our standards, our,
Yeah.
the things that work for us, the things that make us unique. And I as I'm sitting here listening to this, those two things are in conflict. You know, what do I change? No, I don't change anything. I just need to know where I can trip up.
Yeah.
Right.
I think
How to protect my client if that happens.
like with the written request thing, I think about the situation to where everybody loves a Monday morning quarterback, right? Reverse engineer. I think about the situation to where something's going to go awry and they're going to go to you and say, if you didn't advise me about this written request thing, we would have served it and we would have figured out that something was wrong and that was your job and you never told me about that. So that concerns me for you guys, to be honest with you. When I read that, I just, you know, if for somehow something crazy goes wrong with a binder or, you know, something like that, I think, well, if you'd have served that request and I would have known that there was this issue with one of those, you know, and so again, it sets up more liability, I think, to me.
But the alternative is if you're aware of it, make it known. Address the problem. And then I think you avoid this.
Yeah.
Again, if you have to fall back to something, then you have this. But
Well, it's like everything else too, with a contract, this is just black and white, heavy legalese. Nobody knows. It's just like a statute. Nobody knows what's going to happen until it practically goes into play in society. So we don't know how people are going to handle this stuff. We probably won't know until we navigate through it for a year. Maybe this time next November, we might know, you know, the trends we've seen. I mean, I think that's how we best help one another, right? Is, you know, we sit down, we have these types of things, we talk about the black and white, but more importantly, experience is sacrosanct to me. So, you know, when I hear scenarios you guys go through every single day, that helps me be better at my job, vice versa. And I think that's how we'll practically be able to help navigate. But until that time, I think it's going to be extremely dangerous. I really do.
First lawsuits to be coming out of Broward County.
So there's that. So again, I'll just keep chugging on this choo-choo train.
you must work with more honest people.
That's why our contract's more simple.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
So again, we go to line 131 here, 131. This is 8B4. So this new language specifies that the buyer who obtains loan approval may terminate the contract if the buyer cannot timely meet the terms of loan approval after using good faith and diligent effort. Here we are again, good faith. What a worthless term. What is good faith to you is different than good faith to me. If you try at all, I can argue good faith. just give me something to argue. Just take a stab at it. That's good faith. I mean, I think it's like, unfortunately, a lot of things, it's easier to find the negative than the positive, or it's easier to find what bad faith is because it shocks your conscience and it's readily obvious. Good faith, I think, unless you hit every standard of good faith, unless you hit every prong, people are like, oh, well, you could have done 5 out of 5 things. You only did 3 out of 5 things. So again, just remember that good faith is very empty language. In diligent effort to receive the deposit back, the buyer must deliver a written termination notice to the seller prior to the end of the loan approval period. Although this language did not previously appear in the contract, so again, this is designed for specification, the concept is not new. If it were otherwise, such buyers would always lose their deposit despite the fact that they had no ability to meet the conditions of the loan approval. That's how they explain this section.
So they're writing it to protect the buyer's binder.
In a way, they're trying to add more specification for that situation because they're saying there's a trend that they're losing them, and otherwise, they would always lose their deposit. That's what they're saying.
And I think the spirit of the NEFAR agreement is more in that direction as well, protecting the buyer.
For sure, it is for sure. So again, there's that one. We'll just again keep chugging. I don't think that one's monumental. And again, just to be clear, just to be crystal clear. And again, thankfully they do color code these things. So far, the only thing they really, which I would disagree with, I think a lot of this stuff is monumental. So far, the only thing they define as massively monumental is adding the appraisal to loan approval. They continue to harp on that. So that's the only thing they even color code as monumental, which is up for extreme debate, in my opinion. So just food for thought there.
So I've heard that some of the selling agents or listing agents want this because it protected the seller more than the NEFAR. Is this sort of the way that they were protecting their? I don't think when the Florida Association of Realtors or the Florida bar members that did this contract, I don't think they sat down with that agenda. I know that, but that's from.
Does this contract?
That's what I've heard.
Balance
Protection.
between
Right.
protecting seller and buyer, or does it?
It was more
Does it-
protective of the
Does
seller,
it
right?
seem like it's a little bit more seller friendly?
Yeah, I'd probably so. I mean, if I was scaling it, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so, yeah. that's
Well,
probably-
but even this change here about the binder,
Mhm.
that was probably more likely to go to the seller.
Yeah, I mean,
Verbiage,
right. So again, I mean, this one seems, again, more protective of the buyer. Yeah, right.
So it's heading more towards the NEFAR.
Right.
So we can tell their agents, forget it. Don't use that.
I think it's very tough to sit down on, even if you're comparing both, or you're just trying to, what you toll, here's one for the seller, here's one for the buyer. And then what we have at the end is a 12 to 8, is a 12, so that can be very tough for sure. All right, so we'll move on again, keep chugging. I'm now going to line 142. This is 8B5. You'll see here all new language. If buyer fails to timely deliver any written notice provided for in paragraph 8B, 3, or 4 above to seller prior to expiration of the loan approval period, then buyer shall proceed forward with this contract through paragraph 8A, as though paragraph 8A was checked as of the effective date, provided, however, seller may elect to terminate this contract by delivering written notice of termination within 3 days of expiration of the loan approval period. So per this revision, if the buyer stays silent and does not notify the seller in writing as to whether he was approved for the loan, the transaction will proceed as if it's a cash transaction, unless the seller timely terminates the contract within the 3 day period by written notice. Under the previous version of the contract, the buyer's selection of financing did not automatically convert to a cash transaction when the buyer remains silent regarding loan approval.
Basically, you just waive your financing contingency.
Yeah.
If you don't say
Yep.
anything.
But you can still use financing as long as you can meet the time.
Correct. Correct. Yep. I'll just say that again one more time because I do think this is
That is an out if you
Yeah. Again, just one more time for repetition. Per this revision, if the buyer stays silent, does not notify the seller in writing as to whether he or she was approved for the loan, the transaction will proceed as a cash transaction unless the seller timely terminates the contract within the 3-day period by written notice. Under the previous version of the contract, the buyer's selection of financing did not automatically convert to a cash transaction when they remained silent on loan approval. I think that's a sizable change as well.
It converts to a cash transaction.
Yep, basically.
What happened if the buyer doesn't have any
They
cash?
will lose their binder if they back out.
Correct.
They just lose the finance.
That means the binder's up for play. Yep, let's go.
Every transaction is a cash transaction when you get to the closing table.
It is.
Who's dividing the money?
All right, and then one more before we get off this god awful provision. We'll look at line 147. Okay. Here we are, they're basically saying, we're looking at line 147 through line 150, 151. They're saying that this clause was in essence retooled. Love that word. Before, if the buyers obtained a loan approval, they were entitled to a return of their deposit if there was no closing, due to the appraisal being insufficient to meet the terms of the loan approval under paragraph 8B. This is no longer the case because the language that directed the deposit back to the buyer due to the insufficient appraisal was deleted. Now appraisal issues will be resolved at the time buyer determines whether the loan approval is obtained. This is why making it part of loan approval is such a big change. Such a big change. They've retooled this. I think that's a major change as well. You know, that's the ability to use that appraisal to your benefit for a long period of time. Those days are gone. It's wrapped up into loan approval. You can't play that up to the closing date. Oh, and get your binder back. So again, the appraisal is going to become a very, very important and germane part of this process when you use this contract. Can't understate that enough.
I guess I don't understand how, you're saying on the old contract, people were using the appraisal.
Correct.
It's a NEFAR, like there is no.
Correct.
They don't make a distinction. It's like you either have loan approval or you don't, and appraisal is part of that. So you don't have loan approval because of the appraisal.
Yeah, they got tons of complaints and they apparently saw tons of situations to where a low appraisal was used to derail a transaction all the way up until closing. That was their policy, their public policy, so to speak, to change this and make it a subcomponent of loan approval, which is the biggest change in this contract, no question. So.
It seems excessively complicated. Like to me, it's all loan approval. That's what an appraisal is for.
Right.
It's to qualify the property and the value of the home. And if it doesn't meet that, even if it's conditions that need to be fixed on the property, the bank is saying we will not lend this money unless XYZ is rectified. That's still loan approval.
Yep.
You know, it doesn't have to do with property condition or anything necessarily in terms of contract. I don't know.
I think they had a, you know, when that situation occurred, again, which I have seen, I think they just had, you know, a lot of, you know, sellers say, you know, this isn't fair. You know, if that's going to be the case, we should know in a reasonable amount of time, especially not right before closing, so that I can, you know, put my property back on the market. So, I mean, there's again, public policy of that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So before we get off that, anything else we want to address about that one? Just sort of, yes.
Does the seller have the right to receive the full appraisal report?
That was not written in here that I saw.
Because I had a transaction where the inspection.
Wait. So buyer shall upon written request keep seller and broker fully informed about the status of buyer's mortgage loan application, loan processing, appraisal, status of the appraisal.
And I did. I notified that the appraisal came in at value. He said he
Yeah.
wanted a full report. And I said no.
That belongs to the buyer.
Yeah.
As a,
They're just trying to.
I can answer this as an appraisal trainee, that the only, the client is entitled to that report and when the client authorizes. And by law, the buyer is entitled to receive a copy at least 3 days prior to closing.
Yep.
So it's kind of a
And we
great.
don't even
if the
give
buyer
us
is
the
willing
buyer
to
unless the
share-
buyer says it's
If the
okay.
buyer's willing to share, because I actually have this, I had both ends of the deal, and I had a situation where Rick Front Listing appraised $35,000 higher than our contract price. The seller wanted to know how much it appraised for. And I lost the relationship with that seller because I told him, I can't necessarily tell you that. I knew it. I didn't tell him I knew the value. I just said, I can't necessarily tell you that. I literally had to call the Florida legal hotline. I was on the phone with the attorneys, how should I handle this? And long story short, the buyer ended up agreeing to tell him the value. And I thought it was gonna blow the deal up, but he probably thought he was sitting like $1 million house. It was only, it was an $840,000 house. It wasn't like a massive amount, but yeah, so it's
That's
it's
where the
up
lender,
to the
yeah.
buyer.
So the lender,
And you can't just share that.
this particular seller was open door. They were delaying to answer the repair request, which was, I think, about 4 things, but it would be lender required repairs that were needed.
Yeah.
And they were delaying answering whether they were going to do it. And then I notified them that the appraisal was in and it came in at value. And he says he needs that in order to get the repairs. And I said, no, the buyers, because it was $25,000 over what they were purchasing for, the buyers were like, we're gonna get the repairs done. They went and got the repairs done, we closed, but I just thought, I had many times where companies or what have you, or if you wanted to cancel the contract, you need to provide me the appraisal.
If it appraised, if you're canceling because of the appraisal.
Right,
And it still has to be authorized by the buyer.
correct, but they're saying that it says that in the contract, which I read many times, so that's why I'm asking you.
No.
Was this the contract y'all used?
No,
They have their.
oh, yes, I'm sorry, it was the as is.
That's it.
Oh, that's
It was
right.
the as is.
Something in Philip.
Open door only uses as is, they don't use.
All right, let me just hit on a few other things. I know we got, this easy to get lost in that provision, takes a lot of time. So let me just hit a few other things. Then we'll kind of try to wrap up with questions. So again, one thing that I skipped over before I talk about a major change, assignability, just going back to number 7, if no box is checked, then the buyer may not assign the contract. This was a change from the previous version, which did not contain default language. So be cognizant of that. That's line 93. That's a big change. Be cognizant of that.
Can we just talk about that? What is assignability? It's as opposed to assumption. What is assignability?
I mean, assumption you see more in the context of a mortgage. Assignability is just, the ability to sign the contract to any buyer. I mean, there's lots of people, there's lots of entities that are just getting under contract with everything they possibly can find, and then assigning it, and it's a wholesaling, it's a flipping, sort of scenario. So
They go find a buyer, they get the
Right.
property under contract, and they find a buyer to actually buy it, and the buyer buys that paper from them.
Yeah.
Right.
So we're just working with a normal buyer that wants to purchase this house, then do we?
then I would just check may not assign. Yeah, I would, yeah, I would like that better.
So but it says that if you don't check, so by default now is the contract non-assignable? By default, because
Yes.
the default is assignable. By
Yes.
default.
This is a change from the previous version, which did not contain default language, and now it defaults. Yep. Which again was why I wanted to point that one out. All right, so I'm going to jump around here a little bit. Let me just make sure I'm trying to hit the stuff that I think was really good.
The seller assessment.
Number 235.
Okay. Yeah, I did not view that as a major change. I mean, they
Well, it's pretty much stating that if they can't pay it in full, then it reverts back to the buyer.
They're striking B, right? Or
Yep, so they, in special assessments, 236 to 238. Let me see, I was on a different section.
The mom always likes to pay her, providing the seller to pay it in full.
Yeah,
So this is pretty much stating that if they can't pay it in full, then it reverts back to the buyer
correct.
after close.
Previous assessment, let me make sure I found that. This is 9. What's this? I did want to talk about, because again, just because they harp on it, I do want to look at Standard O, again, I mentioned this lightly earlier. This is on page 13. So again, in standard O, they state that this is also a major change. They don't harp at it as much as the appraisal component, but they highlighted it as yellow. So the methods of delivery notices required by the contract have changed. They may be delivered by email or fax, as before, by mail or personal delivery. Please note you may no longer deliver notices through electronic media, except by fax or email. Text messaging is not included as a method of delivery. This change was made because text can disappear over time, making them difficult to use as evidence that notice was given. Since other electronic media were deleted as well, social media postings or any other type of communication not named in this paragraph will not constitute delivery for purposes of giving notice. They harp on that about text messages. That is in, that's in number O. So that's in the standards. That would be page 13, line 651. Okay. There's that one. I will jump to the number 5, page 5. This is line 219. This is changing to the survey clause. Prior was on or before the title evidence deadline. Now it's at least 5 days prior to closing for the survey change. So that is a change from the prior contracts. Make sure it's in there. Yeah, that was right after the financing. Yeah. Yeah, there wasn't a major overhaul. I mean, they put FERPTA charges. They put FERPTA charges on a seller, which they should. I don't know if you guys have ever had a FERPTA transaction. Good luck. Yeah, complete pain. I've only had 2 of them ever. They're extremely difficult. You have to hold a percentage. You have to deal with the IRS. I mean, it's a walking nightmare if it's a seller FERPTA. But they just put the charges of that withholding and reporting on the seller. They clarified that. So that should be the case because they're the ones that created that problem. It's interesting to see too, as we stroll through the latter pages, right, that you don't see a lot of heavy lifting changes, right? Special assessments, they write some stuff in. Disclosures, they add in the mold inspection rider, which is one of the 3 new riders. So you want to familiarize yourself with that. Again, there are a total of 3 new riders. But when we get to, what are always our big provisions that we debate about all the time? It's financing, it's home inspection. When we get to section 12, the property inspection and repair, those are not heavy lifting changes compared to the financing, right? This is on page 7. They allow you to now inspect watercraft lifts and related equipment. Okay, I mean, I don't think that's some groundbreaking change. That's right there in line 324. It is interesting in 339. And let me just pull that. I have a note on that. This is 11, 9, 324. Okay. So in 329, and this change is one of the few ones that is only applicable to the non-as-is contract, not the as-is contract. This change allows the seller to repair items covered by paragraph 12 without obtaining estimates should this be acceptable to the seller. So that's a change.
They can just fix it, not.
Yeah, I mean,
So they can go and fix it. They can use handyman to fix it versus.
Yeah.
Unlicensed.
Like a screen.
yeah, without obtaining estimates. So yeah,
In the as-is has no impairment.
yeah, exactly. So that's not in the as-is, correct. But besides that, I was expecting, lots of changes. Look on page 8, nothing. I mean, as we continue on, There's literally no changes at all. And then as you go through the rest of the contract, there isn't too much. Again, briefly, let me state on page 10. I know one of the reasons, again, I do not like this contract is on page 10, number 17. I've been in this situation, again, practical experience. I believe when you put the ability to get attorney's fees and costs in a contract, it creates more problems than good. I love the NEFAR contract that you have to assume your own attorney's fees and costs if you get in litigation. Why? Because that promotes people to resolve issues. I've been in countless litigation cases, countless, to where I knew the other side's argument was awful, terrible, but they will come to you and they will say, are you sure, buddy? Because if not, your guy's gonna spend a bunch of money with you. And then when I beat you in court, I love that, you're gonna pay for all of my attorney's fees as well. Do I wanna take that gamble? Do I wanna take the risk of getting a bar complaint even if I lose, even though I shouldn't get a bar complaint? A malpractice claim. You know, people go crazy when they lose litigation cases. They don't hire lawyers to lose, they hire lawyers to win. And so, for the people. So, I think if you go in an attorney's office and they see, that's the first thing they look for, a litigation attorney, because then they can take it as a contingency. Or then they'll say, oh, don't worry about it. I mean, facts are on our side, law's on our side, we're gonna win, we're gonna get all your fees back. They won't tell you that when they win those fees, all that is a judgment on a sheet of paper recorded in the public records, and you have to collect on that. And if you're not contingency, you have to keep paying that guy through the entire process. I just like when a binder dispute hits or a breach of contract hits or something blows up at closing, you better be real about your position if you go and drop a $10,000 retainer check in an attorney's office and you know you'll never get that money back. That's why I like NEFAR. And that's why one of the main reasons I don't like this contract. So just pointing that out. So again, just that's page 11. They do add COVID language about, you know, acts of God, right? This classic clause. They add in line 566, government actions, mandates, shutdowns, epidemics, pandemics. So, you know, we're cleaning that up a little bit. That's put in there. But that really is the bulk of the changes to this without getting into the riders, which would be, you know, again, I mean, we could probably do an entire class on the riders as well, because again, there's 3 new ones. So we could go through all of those in detail, and it's just too much to do this all at once. And we could go through all the changes they made to the original ones. Cause again, we did 7 riders were updated and 3 new ones were created. So we could do a class on all 10 of those riders as well. But that's the crux of my notes. Again, I wanted to go until 12. We're right there. So yes.
Go back on,
Yep.
line 559.
559.
Yeah, they took out the 5 PM. So does that mean, what is end of day?
Yeah, so I've got notes on that. 1 second. Let me get back to this. This is commercial position again. So this is 18F time. Time is of the essence was moved to the beginning of this paragraph to stress its importance. Added language to clarify the time zone where the property is located, rather than where the parties are, is the basis for computing a calendar day where the property is located. The new contract also changed the time calculation when a time period or date ends on a Saturday, Sunday, or on a day that is either a national legal public holiday or on a Friday or Monday when such a holiday is observed. These time periods or dates for performance will extend to the next calendar date, which is not Saturday, Sunday, or on the day a national public holiday is observed. Note, there is no longer a 5 PM cutoff. Correct.
11:59?
What's that?
Does that make it 11:59?
That's what I assume.
Yeah.
That's what I assume. Yep. So, I mean,
Wake up from sleeping.
again, that's why I question these major minor changes again. How many times do you practically see the time come into play, in a number of contexts of these contracts? When was it sent, et cetera? So they just take that out, 5 PM's out. So, I mean, there's a lot of people that are still going to be operating under that context as well. So that's a good point. And again, they have really good notes on both of these contracts. That's on the website. It goes over a lot of the stuff I went over today. And again, we're just going to have to practically see how this plays out.
I got a question from you for a title company question.
Sure.
Are you guys like, you guys disperse the funds
Yeah.
from the transaction? Like, do you have a time frame that has to be done?
Well, if you don't want an angry call pretty quickly. So at the end of the day, I mean, I look at it as a business day. Again, so we're a little bit different. In a lot of big title companies, these jobs are separated. There's an escrow guy, there's a closing attorney, et cetera. I do all the closings myself. I send all the wires myself because that is the most critical component, I think, of liability for my company. So if somebody messes that up, I want it to be me. If I am not in a closing, I'm sending that wire while you're getting in the car to leave. Like I do it that if I have funding approval from the lender, we post close as soon as possible. I send all the wires as soon as possible. If it's a seller wire, you guys that work with me know this. I send an email to the seller it's because most sellers pre-sign these days. I send an email to the seller that has a fully executed alt attached. I let them know that the deal is fully closed. I send a confirmation of the wire transfer, which has the Fed reference number, and then they can start looking for it in their account. Now, sometimes if I'm back to back, or then I'm volume sending wires from 3 to 5 o'clock, but I've never had a normal transaction that was closed, funded, all money's in, that the wire went out the next business day. That should never happen. Never.
But you send checks out to insurance companies?
Same day. There's a little bit of that too. Like insurance company checks are probably the biggest issue and one of the biggest issues in my business because, you either eat the FedEx cost on every single file to FedEx them, or you just regular mail them. They constantly.
Nobody's supposed to sit on them.
No. But the mail system again is very unreliable. So if you send it out a regular mail, I mean, that's why so many title companies eat the FedEx costs because they get so many complaint calls, because the insurance agent will blow it up. Oh, the house is uninsured, and then even if you mail it the same day, you can still run into issues on that. Okay. So good question. Yep.
Actually had a closing where the buyer had a primary mortgage and then they did a second, HELOC.
Yeah, come back to that.
So I had a situation where we were funded with the title company, but the lender was like, you've got this federal law that there's 3-day right of rescission for I can't remember if it was a HELOC or if it was a.
So in a refinance, there is a 3-day right of rescission.
Okay.
So only on a refinance.
They were
Primary residence.
They misinterpreted it because the dude actually showed me the law on the buyer. Like the buyer was actually a big mortgage guy. Like they shouldn't be doing that. So I had a situation with the seller. So like we were funded, but the title company could not release the funds to the seller. Like they had to basically just hold it for 3 days. Yeah,
that only applies to a refinance of a primary residence. That never applies to a buy-sell, and it never applies to a refinance of an investment property.
The lender applied it. It was like Center State Bank or something. They're like, no, they have to do this. And it was a big argument anyway.
I've never heard of that in my life. Yeah.
On the rocks for a few days.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, you commonly see confusion in refinances about the 3-day right of rescission. A lot of people think that they're getting, especially if it's a cash out refi, which again is the new wave of refinances in a way. A lot of people get confused that they're getting the money the same day, but you have to tell them it's a 3 business day right to cancel right of rescission. You cannot circumvent that. Yeah. Yep. Any other questions? All right, thank you guys. Appreciate it very much. Thank you. Thank you.
We got some lunch out there for you guys if you want to grab some.
Sure.
Zeki's. Yeah.
Zeki's.
Yes.